It was called the ice storm of all ice storms. But was it a storm or storms? That makes a difference. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. All right, I'll spare you the suspense. It was a massive combination of 5 smaller successive ice storms in January of 1998. On this day in weather history. Like with many stories that are so historically devastating, we come to sometimes misremember them in their finer details. For instance, many events we remember as the storm were actually a cluster of several. But it came in and through like a train across a narrow tract of land spanning most of eastern Canada and the North Atlantic of the US. And for more than 80 hours, man was ravaged by the gods of ice and rain. Too dramatic? Well, that's what it felt like for the millions in southern Quebec and eastern Ontario, while they were pelted with up to 100 millimeters of freezing rain and ice pellets in an ice storm that lasted for 5 days. As a result, there were roughly 30,000 utility poles that fell in the province of Quebec alone, and that resulted in about half of their population without power in the winter while covered in ice. In fact, at its worst, there were 3.5 million Quebecers, over 1 million Ontarians, and thousands of Maritimers who were left in the dark and the cold, and many of those were like this for several weeks. Among them were at least 600,000 people who had to be evacuated from their homes and relocated into hotels or other shelters with emergency power backup. And this included several long-term care facilities with residents who were among the most vulnerable to conditions like this. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. And oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. When this was finally cleared, it was confirmed that 35 people died as a direct result of the ice storm's effects. This included carbon monoxide poisoning from generators that had been brought indoors, trauma from accidents of several different varieties, fire, and it was later discovered that this included due to indoor wood-burning stoves that were left unattended, and hypothermia, and that was the saddest of it all because the power was out and it was covered in ice. And now, what happened? Let's break down the details of the science. On January 4th, 1998, an upper-level area of low pressure stalled out over the Great Lakes, so you have an upper low. When this happens, it'll create an almost conveyor belt effect that taps into wherever it can get moisture, and in this case, it was the warm, moist air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, and it directed it toward the upper St. Lawrence Valley. So, while this was in place, there had to be a high pressure somewhere, and it was. There were 2 of them, and it was happening at the same time. Sitting farther north in Labrador, there was an area of high pressure, so therefore its return flow at this time of the year provided a very easterly, northeasterly flow of very cold air near the surface, and that pushed back into the St. Lawrence where the moisture is, meeting that tropical air mass. Plus, there was also another very large and strong area of high pressure literally anchored out in the mid-Atlantic, and that was acting as a wall against which nothing moving east could either pass or push through. This Bermuda High, as it is called, trapped everything that was developing to stay right there and expend all of its energy right there. Okay, that's the setup. Now enter the weather. With this atmospheric fortress in place between January 5th and January 10th, a series of lows, remember, with all the moisture coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, began that production line marching into this region. And that is where we started. For more than 80 hours, steady freezing rain and drizzle fell over an area of several thousand square miles of eastern Ontario, and that included the capital of Canada, Ottawa, Brockville, and Kingston, and an extensive area in southern Quebec, northern New York, and northern New England. The 1998 ice storm led to the largest deployment of Canadian military personnel since their involvement in the Korean War. Of the over 16,000 Canadian Forces personnel that were deployed, 12,000 were sent to assist in Quebec, with the remaining 4,000 in Ontario at the height of the crisis. The storm had an enormous financial impact as well, costing an estimated $5.5 billion in insurance claims, utility repairs, and lost productivity. During the shutdown, schools and universities were closed and millions of people suffered financially from lost wages because work was either closed or it was simply impossible to get there. All in, this is still considered to be among the worst natural disasters in Canadian history. This day in weather history. Tomorrow is January 5th, and as we all gear up for the hopes that skiing will be allowed again someday soon, imagine if you had already had a decent to amazing start, only to have the weather move in and ruin everything. On This Day in Weather History, the podcast, with me, your host, Chris May.